don't know about y'all, but did y'all notice the change in that song? That's one of those you got to sing a couple of times, get used to singing it that way, and then just, oh, okay, we can do this. Beautiful song. Love the song. That's the first time I noticed the change. Anyway, songbooks like to do that. They like to switch things up on us. Okay. I hope everyone had a great day. I'm not as emotional now as I was after services this morning. Thank you very much for all that y'all did. We thoroughly appreciate it. There's one thing I can say about Cloverdale. Y'all have been one of the greatest inspirations that Heather and I have known, and that y'all have been for us. With that said, this will be my last sermon for the year 2018, because y'all have Jack speaking next Sunday morning, and our young men will be conducting services next Sunday evening. So this will be the last time you'll have to deal with me this year. However, the first Sunday evening is when y'all get to hear me again. So we'll be back. It's just going to take a couple of weeks, and we'll be in there and running again as we have been. I thought I'd end the season on a lesson that I would hope helps to inspire, encourage, and help us to think about where we are and where we want to be. One of the things that I've been trying to do in my life, and one of the things I've been trying to do, especially as I'm getting to the age I'm at now, is goal setting. And I think it's one of those things that if congregations, I've said this to elders, congregations that do not set goals for the year set themselves up for failure. Because they ought to have a point where they want to be. You know, it's not failure to not reach your goal. It's failure to not try to reach your goal. You know, sometimes we learn, hey, we can't get that high. Maybe we need to bring it down a little and then build ourselves up further. So this evening, I want us to look at standing for God. As we move into 2019, I want us to understand that we have that ability. I hear people all the time tell us, oh, people don't want to hear Christians, or they hear things in the news about such and such was taken to court because of this or because of that, and it all has to do with the Bible. Well, here's the case that Christians need to understand. The reason these things are taking place is because Christians stopped speaking. Christians stopped being what we needed to be for the world. It's not their fault, it's our fault if we want to point blame. And so we as Christians need to realize we've got to take that stand. When people persecute us, we need to understand they're persecuting us, but they're not persecuting us individually as much as they are persecuting God. Jesus said that in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. He tells us exactly what you and I need to know if we're going to be persecuted. So we shouldn't find it strange when people do what the Bible says they're going to do. We should rely on the one that can take care of it and who told us to rely on Him. And remember what Paul wrote about what God will do for those that cause tribulation for the elect. You see, God is looking out. And so when it comes to God, you and I have to ask ourselves, where do we stand? And do we need to take that stand? And my answer to that question, do we need to take that stand, is yes. We need to take that stand, not only in 2019, but we need to take that stand for the rest of our life. It needs to start tonight, and it needs to move through our life. Look at verses 21 through 23 of Matthew chapter 7. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Can you go back up to 22, please? Look at verse 22. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? that's not non-believers he's talking about. That's people that did not obey God. You see, go back in and look at what it says here in these 3 verses. He starts it off by saying, many will say, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord. Why do you say that, Lord? Because there are some that are not going to, notice what he says, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven, verse 21. It's all about where we stand. It's all about the things that we have. Remember this morning we talked about the true and the real Christmas story, and we talked about the love of God, and we talked about in the last part as we were getting to the end of that, we were discussing that we show our love through our obedience. That's where it comes in. Why do we take a stand? Because we're taught, be steadfast, immovable. That's why we take a stand. Is everyone going to like it when we do? No. Is everyone going to pat us on the back? No. Some are going to throw rocks. Some are going to be ugly. Because when the light shines in darkness, man sees his wickedness, and he doesn't want people to see the wickedness that he has, so he doesn't want that light there. And when you and I take that stand for God, it's like we are taking a candle and we're holding up a candle in the dark to show those that are in the dark the way out of the dark. Jesus was a light unto the world. His words are a light unto our path. These are things we need to understand and we need to realize. For our remaining time, I want to talk about 5 individuals this evening. 5 individuals. 4 of them took a stand. Not sure about the 5th yet. We'll see about that here in a second. Our first person we talk about is Daniel. And in Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 24, you get to a point where Daniel it comes into this great information that he's taught about. You can't pray to anyone but to the king. And if you're caught praying to anyone but the king, you're going to be put into the lion's den. And Daniel doesn't hesitate. Daniel goes and with his window open, prays to the Lord openly. Daniel took a stand. And in taking that stand, the religious leaders of the day, knowing who Daniel was, knowing Daniel would do that, knowing all of that, persuaded the king to implement this, takes Daniel to the king, and the king then immediately knew he was set up. Because the king liked Daniel. But the king couldn't go back on his word. And so Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. But something different happened that night. Daniel wasn't sure how things... I'm almost certain I can say this because I could put myself in Daniel's place and I could say I would not be for certain. So I'm pretty certain I could say Daniel wasn't for certain how things were going to turn out, but Daniel knew one thing. God was going to take care of it. However God dealt with it, however God took care of the situation, Daniel wasn't worried about that because he knew that he was in God's hands. And so he took that stand. And in taking that stand, those that were against him, those that were against God, stood up against him and tried to make him look like the bad guy, and they were the victims. Sounds like today, doesn't it? But God that night sent an angel to shut the lions' mouths, and they did not harm Daniel. I often wondered if Daniel walked up to a couple of them and petted them like he would a common house cat. And the next morning, the king was so anxious about the situation that he ran to the place where this den that these lions were in that Daniel was locked into. He ran to it and he has them open it up. And when they open it up, he calls out Daniel, and Daniel says, "Hey, I'm here. God took care of me." He's brought out, and the king immediately scratches that law and has the men that came to him and set him up on this and their families thrown into the lion's den. I'm going to tell you this, those lions were hungry because they didn't get any of the Daniel. And God didn't shut their mouth that time. God took care of it. Oh, well, that shows that God's not all loving. No, that shows that God is just. And He takes care of those that He said He would take care of. And He handles those that He said He would handle. God does not lie. He said, if you obey me, you will live. If you don't obey me, you will be separated. He teaches us that. Paul, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 through 8, we find Paul in a unique situation because he's writing to Timothy, his beloved friend Timothy. And I love the words he uses in this because he says, look, the time of my departure is at hand. But I'm okay with that. This is Dennis paraphrasing that, by the way, so that we have a better thought on this as well. But I'm okay with it because I have run my course. I have done my job. I have lived faithfully to God. And because I did these things, God has a crown waiting for me. And not only for me, but for everyone that looks for, strives for, longs for the appearing of Jesus Christ. You see, Paul wasn't always a good man, as people would see it. Because Paul started out as Saul, and Saul persecuted Christians, and I can imagine at first there must have been a lot of Christians after they heard that Paul was converted were kind of a little leery. And I kind of picture it to the extent of what we heard many years ago about Jeffrey Dahmer and how several people, I remember hearing, faithful Christians, well, I don't know that he became a Christian. Well, it's not a matter of whether we know he became a Christian. It's a matter of what we're told and us taking it by faith. Well, how do you know he did? I don't. But I can tell you someone that does. And that someone is God. And so Paul had to deal with a situation. As Saul, here he was, he had been persecuting the church, he'd been killing Christians, and he's going to have to live with that later in his Christian life. But yet he was so amazing. Because here's the truth about Paul. Whether he was a Jewish leader as Saul, or whether he was a Christian evangelist as Paul, he was zealous for whichever way he went, and he took that stand, and he held on to it, and he did what he needed to do because he knew what was needed. Yes, he condemned some that didn't need to be condemned. But he was who he needed to be for God. And he even in his own words writes, I never went against my conscience when it came to the Word of God. He earnestly believed that as Saul, he was doing the right thing. He believed that with all of his heart because he felt that Christians were blaspheming God. And yet when he saw Jesus and he heard the words from Ananias and he was taught by Christ later, he full-heartedly accepted his responsibility, changed completely. And we don't know how many people became Christians because of him. Why? Because he took the stand. And because he took that stand, he was able to say, I have finished my race. And I'm okay with it. My time of leaving this earth is at hand, and I'm going to leave. I am going to die, but I'm okay with it because God has a crown of righteousness waiting for me. What an amazing statement. And then there's Peter. Peter in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 32, I'll just tell you, is Peter walking on water. We use this quite often, and it's referenced quite often to Peter. But there are some things that you have heard me preach on about this situation that I think are so amazing that we need to understand a deeper meaning and a deeper understanding about Peter. Peter was one of those that when he was committed, he was committed. It may have took him a little bit. He may have got off the path just a little bit. He may have spoke too quickly in some other areas. But Peter was committed. Well, how do you say that Peter was committed? The night that Jesus comes to Peter and the 11, as they are in that boat in the middle of a storm and he is walking across the water, it was Peter that got out of the boat. He believed Jesus. He understood Jesus. He may have still had some backwards thinking, but when Jesus said, come, he did not hesitate. He took a stand. He took a stand so much that the night in which Jesus was betrayed, he drew his sword and cut off Malchus's left ear. And I will be the many, many, many people to tell you, part of the many people to tell you, that he wasn't aiming for his ear. Malchus ducked, and that's why his ear got hit. Malchus is probably the only one that saw that sword swing, and he ducked. And Jesus tells him to put up your sword, and he picks up the ear, and he puts it back. If there's anyone that could have known the power of Jesus, Malchus was the man. But Peter took a stand. He was willing to die for Christ that night. In fact, he was showing that he was willing to, because this is a mob that's come out, and they only had 2 men with swords. And let me tell you, it doesn't take a mob long to take over 2 people with a sword. Because you got to swing the sword. You got to thrust the sword. He took the stand. Yes, we can always go back and we can always talk about what took place in the courtyard of the high priest. We can always talk about Jesus denied him 3 times. Peter denied him 3 times. Yes, he did. And yes, he had to deal with that, which took a little while to get over. And I'm sure in his own mind he's thinking, if I had just let them kill me when I was in that garden, I wouldn't have to deal with this. Peter writes a couple of the books that we have in the New Testament. His life is completely turned around after the resurrection. He becomes for the Jews what Paul became for the Gentiles. It is he that took the stand on the day of Pentecost. It is he that is named. Why? Because he needed to. And he saw that he needed to. And he did just that. Another one we have in the Old Testament is a man by the name of David. He fought a man by the name of Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Everybody knows the story of David and Goliath. Not Daniel and Goliath, but David and Goliath. They all know that story. They know that David was so small that when he put the king's armor on, that it was so big on him that it would fall off. And I can only imagine how he must have felt. But I can only imagine also, because notice this, as you remember this story, as he's going out to meet this giant, this man that has called them out, that is ridiculing God, Daniel picks up 5 stones on his way out. I don't know why 5. Maybe he felt like he needed them. Maybe he was afraid he was going to miss the first shot, or maybe he thought he might even miss the first 4. We don't know why. There's no necessary significance with the 5. But he picked up 5 stones. And he stands before this giant of a man. And he fights him. But before all that happened, when Goliath calls them out and is ridiculing God, it is David that says, isn't one of y'all going to go out and face this man? Do you not realize that God has given them into our hands? Why are y'all cowering? Why are y'all back here? You need to be up there. Little man. The only reason David was there is he was bringing food to his brothers. And when he hears Goliath, is there not anyone? He says, I'll do it. And I can only imagine when he stepped out and that giant saw him, how humorous to the giant David must have been. Because not only did he come out, but he didn't come out with any type of armor, and he didn't have any type of weapon other than a slingshot. And apparently his God, Goliath didn't understand. But with one shot, it hit him in the head. He fell down, and with Goliath's own sword, David chopped off Goliath's head. Why? Because David took the stand and said, God has given them to us. What an amazing situation. So that brings us to the 5th person. And I ask, what about you? Are we willing to take that stand? In a world that seems so corrupt and so evil that you and I cannot even fathom, it's so bad. Isn't that the way people describe it? Do we not read in the scriptures about how bad the world was during the first century church when the church grew? Maybe we need to stop looking at the negative and look at the positive. Oh, there's no one that wants to hear the word. That isn't true. That's a lie. That's propaganda by Satan. People want to know about God. They want to be on the winning side. They want to know the things that God has and can offer them. Oh, I don't know about that today. So many people. They didn't know what they wanted in the first century either until the gospel started being spread. They didn't know they needed to know about God until the gospel was spread. But I can tell you this, in the first century, there were several thousands upon thousands upon thousands that responded when they found out about this Jesus that died on a cross, not because he had to, but because he wanted to for them. And that they were living in a way that they couldn't even be able to look at him because of the sin in their life. And they had to be taught, even in some cases, what sin was, just like we may have to be today. Today is no different. Probably we can look at today and see even better an understanding of the first century and what the church went through in the first century. But that three-letter word with a question mark, we have to look deep. We have to understand. We have to decide. When standing in the throne room in Isaiah chapter 6 and seeing this magnificent symbol that was taking place, Isaiah heard the simple words, "Who will go?" And he didn't look around to see who was going to raise his hand. We found volunteers in the Marine Corps very easily. It was amazing how easy it was. And I'm sure those that were in the military probably remember these exact same ways that we did. Y'all probably did too. They'd say, "We need a volunteer," and everybody would take a step back except one guy, and he was the volunteer. That's not what we're talking about. Isaiah didn't look around to see if he was the only one volunteering. Isaiah didn't stop to even consider. He said, "Here am I, send me." Why? Because he saw the power and the mercy and the love of God. Just like the four individuals we looked at tonight. They saw the power and the mercy and the love of God. It's time for the world to see what the church is. It's time for them to see what true Christianity is. It's time for us to take the stand. Will you? This evening, if you're not a Christian, I plead with you. Don't let it go by. Do what you need to do. Do it tonight. For those of us that are Christians, if we're not living it, do something about it now before it's too late. Let us help. Step out and come forward right now. While together we stand and sing this invitation song.